Time to teach the authorship controversy. Nope. Shakespeare can make his way in the world without my help. I'm talking about the eternal classic, A Visit from St. Nicholas, otherwise known as "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." I'm assuming you're familiar with this poem if you're here watching this video. If you're not, or if you've only read the first few lines, go read the whole thing and then come back. Or better, you don't even have to read it yourself. I will put a link to the earliest text in the description of this video, but I'll also do a separate video and read the whole poem for you. Briefly, to sum up, it's narrated by a guy who is about to go to sleep on Christmas Eve when St. Nicholas shows up in a flying sleigh drawn by reindeer, flies up on the roof, and comes down the chimney. He's described as smoking a pipe, the stump of a pipe, and he leaves presents in the children's stockings, which the children have left hanging up in the expectation of gifts from someone. And then St. Nicholas gives the narrator a nod and taps the side of his nose as a conspiratorial gesture, which seems to be kind of like saying, "Wouldn't you like to know how and why this is all happening?" And he flies back off in his reindeer sleigh. It's a funny poem, and it's slightly spooky for the narrator, who is just standing there as this weird supernatural guy breaks into his house, does something nice, and nods and leaves. This is the poem that helped spread the image of Santa Claus that we have today as a friendly bearded guy who brings you presents in a flying sleigh. It's a highly repeated, imitated, parodied poem. It's the first appearance in print of the phrase "Happy Christmas." This is the poem that named Santa's reindeer. It wasn't written by the guy you thought it was! It was written by a different guy! Much of what I'm about to tell you is from a book called Author Unknown, On the Trail of Anonymous, by Dawn Foster, who is an English literature professor who does textual analysis to identify unattributed writing. Most of this book is focused on criminal cases like the Unabomber, but there's a whole chapter devoted to the authorship controversy over A Visit from St. Nicholas. Most of my facts are drawn either from this source or from the Wikipedia entry on the poem, which is largely informed by this book or reactions to the book. I'm also indebted to Mary Van Duisen for maintaining a website with a poetry archive that has been my sole source for some of the crucial poems. Here are the facts where everybody seems to agree. On December 23rd, 1823, a newspaper called The Sentinel in Troy, New York, published a poem called Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, acquired anonymously by the editor Orville Hawley. The poem refers to the visitor only as St. Nicholas or St. Nick, but the editorial intro calls him Santa Claus. It was republished in other newspapers and in almanacs and magazines over the next few years. Sometime after that, when it was reprinted again, Orville Hawley coyly says that it's by a gentleman from New York who is a scholar as well as a writer. Years pass. In 1836 or 7, the poem is republished in the New York Book of Poetry by the editor Charles Fenno Hoffman. He attributes it to Clement Clark Moore, literature professor and real estate developer who made a fortune selling parcels of his personal estate to become what's now Chelsea in Manhattan. The poem is widely reprinted after that with Moore's name on it, and he doesn't say anything about it initially. More years pass. In 1844, Moore's daughters encourage him to publish a collection of his poetry and include A Visit from St. Nicholas. Moore writes to the former owner of the Troy Sentinel to ask him how they received the poem back in 1823. Sadly, I don't have access to Moore's exact wording in the letter because I would love to scrutinize his word choices. As far as I can gather, no one has a copy of Moore's letter, but we do have the editor's response saying, quote, "At the time of its first publication, I did not know who the author was, but have since been informed that you were the author. The response is ambiguous enough that it doesn't tell me whether Moore's question was along the lines of, "Tell me about how you published my poem," or whether it was along the lines of, "Tell me how you published A Visit from St. Nicholas." Anyway, the response is that a local resident named Sarah Sackett sent it into the paper, and the paper didn't know at the time it was by Moore. Since then, Mrs. Sackett has died, the paper has closed, Orville Hawley has moved away, and Charles Fenno Hoffman, the person who initially named Moore as the author of the poem, has been committed to a mental hospital. All for unrelated reasons, I'm sure. My point is just that everyone involved in the original publication is dead or out of contact. Moore publishes his collected poems, but only A Visit from St. Nicholas receives a lot of attention. In 1863, Moore is 83 and does an interview with the New York Historical Society, which is entirely focused on his being the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas. And later that same year, he dies. Back in September, Mr. Editor and I went to Old Sturbridge Village for the day, and while we were there, we infiltrated a meeting of the New England Santa Society. They were delightful. 5 or 6 plainclothes Santas, as many Mrs. Clauses, and a guest speaker were all assembled. They were discussing A Visit from St. Nicholas, and their speaker invoked Clement Clarke Moore's story about how he came to write the poem. Moore's story is that in 1822, he went shopping in Greenwich Village for a turkey on Christmas Eve, made up the poem in his head while riding in a one-horse open sleigh. Wrote it down at home, and read it aloud to his family on Christmas Day before dinner. The speaker noted that it was likely none of this was true. Her point was only that Moore started talking about the poem for the first time decades after it first appeared, and the tale of its creation was not that much of a story initially, but it's been repeated and embellished by other people since then, so it's become an amusing anecdote. I bring this up so you'll notice that even the people who aren't challenging Moore's authorship often note that the poem's writing and publishing history is underdocumented and confusing. There are a non-zero number of people who claim that Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas wasn't written by Clement Clarke Moore. Instead, allegedly, it was written by Major Henry Livingston Jr. of Poughkeepsie, New York. He lived from 1748 to 1828, so older than Moore, who was born in 1779. Livingston was a Revolutionary War vet, gentleman farmer, and eventually Justice of the Peace. Of Dutch and English descent, had a broad range of hobbies, notably writing a lot of poetry, including light verse that he would use in a throwaway context a lot of the time, such as in letters to loved ones, and in postal carriers' addresses. That last concept was new to me. A carrier's address was a printed monologue, usually a poem, that would be published as a separate sheet from the newspaper, and the newspaper carriers would hand them out on New Year's Day as a way to urge their clients to tip them or give them gifts in exchange for all their hard work through the previous year. Livingston wrote them regularly for the Poughkeepsie Journal and another paper called the Political Barometer, fabulously. Also, he would handwrite a lot of personal poetry and, as I've said, send it to the family member for whom he wrote it, and then never do anything else with it because it had achieved the goal for which he'd written it. The earliest person to say that the poem was misattributed is Eliza Clement Brewer, who married Livingston's son Charles. She says this around 1859, only within the family, when she sees the poem being republished yet again with attribution to Moore. 3 of Livingston's children agreed that they remembered Livingston writing it somewhere between 1805 and 1810. No one is writing letters to the editors about this, though, even though Moore was still around in 1859. He lived till 1863, remember, but none of the family appears to have challenged his authorship. Maybe because he was old and respected, maybe because they were worried he'd take them to court if they went public, and maybe because the Livingston descendants don't have any hard evidence. Another family member, also named Henry Livingston, would say later that his father, and then his uncle, had had the original manuscript of the poem in Livingston's handwriting, but the family moved to Wisconsin and their house burned down and took the manuscript with it. Around 1889, several Livingston descendants are in touch with each other and discussing whether they can prove Livingston's authorship. Ultimately, they decide they can't. There are multiple other attempts down the generations to go public with the claim, publishing the case in various papers with uneven responses. Most of the claims don't draw much attention, but at one point in 1970, a descendant got the president of Vassar on board with Livingston's authorship, and in 2000, Mary Van Duysen brings the case to Dawn Foster. Following the publication of Author Unknown, enough people believe the Livingston claims that you'll see it discussed as a serious question often when the poem comes up. To my shock, the Poetry Foundation website has an entry attributing the poem to Livingston as though it were an open and shut case. Let me get the bad arguments out of the way. Dawn Foster goes to great lengths to convince us Livingston has to be the author because he's likable and Clement Clarke Moore sounds unpleasant. I am not going to put energy into that, because I think Foster is smearing Moore's character in service of his goal. Beyond that, I also think a writer can turn out good work while being an awful person. To give a safely distanced example, Evelyn Waugh's books are funny, while Evelyn Waugh the person was hateful by all accounts. Writing is not a popularity contest. Dawn Foster is cherry-picking his examples of Moore's other poetry to make it sound like Moore could never be playful. Now we're doing our best to be fair. I've skimmed the poems that we know to be by each man, and Livingston could be serious while Moore could be playful. And overall, I'm not going to sit here and go, well, we don't know it didn't happen, and acting as if I can prove a negative, like the buffoons who think Shakespeare was someone else. Let's see what we have left when we rely only on evidence generally accepted. There's no hard evidence for Livingston's authorship. No one has a manuscript of the poem in Livingston's handwriting, since it was presumably lost in that house fire. There isn't a clear story as to how the poem would have made it to the paper where it was published if it was written by Livingston. This is all only circumstantial evidence. However, Thoreau said, some circumstantial evidence is very strong, as when you find a trout in the milk. Side note for people who live in a world where adulterated milk is not as common as it was in the 1800s. Thoreau's point is that someone diluted that milk with river water. My point is that it's worth paying attention to circumstantial evidence. I've compiled the most convincing circumstantial evidence for Henry Livingston's authorship, and here it is in a bulleted list. That's it. He sounds right. There's only one bullet, but it's important. We have other poems that we know were by Clement Clarke Moore, and most of them don't sound like A Visit from St. Nicholas. Lots of Moore's work is in iambic pentameter. Poetry nerd time. Quick and dirty explanation. Iambic pentameter. An iamb goes da-dum, and iambic pentameter is 5 of those in each line. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Super common for plays and long narrative poetry. Chaucer used it, Shakespeare used it. One factor is that it mimics the flow and rhythm of normal speech in English, but it also doesn't draw attention to itself while still giving some structure. Here are a couple of iambic lines that we know are by Clement Clarke Moore. To me 'tis given your virtue to secure from custom's force and pleasure's dangerous lure. Yes, it's from a poem telling a girl off for inviting him to a dance. Yes, this quote was cherry-picked by Dawn Foster. Still. I have to admit that a lot of Moore's verse is moralistic and judgmental, even if I don't think that would have kept him from writing A Visit from St. Nicholas. An anapest, though, goes da-da-dum, Anapestic tetrameter is 4 of those in a line. That's what A Visit from St. Nicholas is written in. Anapestic tetrameter. It pulls a lot of attention, and it gives you a galloping feeling, and a lot of people, including me, think it feels playful and funny. C.S. Lewis said that every literary form dictates what you can say as well as how you say it. I think anapests are inherently funny, like limericks. You could use them to write about a serious subject, but it would be hard. You'd have your work cut out for you. Everyone's got strong associations with the meter. For example, Dr. Seuss wrote an anapestic tetrameter. Did I ever tell you that Mrs. McCabe had 23 sons and she named them all Dave? Clement Clarke Moore only ever wrote one poem in anapests that we know about, The Pig and the Rooster. By contrast, Henry Livingston seems like he wrote an anapestic tetrameter every time he sneezed. Here's the beginning of a letter to his brother Beekman from when they were both young. He is gloating over how Beekman's stuck in upstate New York working in a store while he, Livingston, is home having his every want attended to. To my dear brother Beekman, I sit down to write. 10 minutes past 8 and a very cold night. Not far from me sits, with a valency cap on, our very good cousin Elizabeth Tappan. A tighter young seamstress you'd ne'er wish to see, and she, blessings on her, is sewing for me. Just to be fair, here are the first 4 lines of Moore's poem The Pig and the Rooster. On a warm sunny day in the midst of July, a lazy young pig lay stretched out in his sty, like some of his betters, most solemnly thinking that the best things on earth are good eating and drinking. Similarly cute and playful to my mind. They could both be by the same person. But also anybody being playful in anapestic tetrameter is going to sound to us at least a little like A Visit from St. Nicholas. That's why it's so easy and fun to imitate. Livingston lived from 1748 to 1828. I want to set up one question in order to knock it down. If I was debunking the Livingston claim, I would say, well, the poem was published in 1823 and republished a lot of times before Livingston's death. Why didn't he ever say anything about it? To which, I'd answer, there's a very good chance he might not have known about it. Not everybody reads every newspaper. It was published anonymously, and this was happening before the internet. Livingston definitely read the Poughkeepsie papers because he was known for publishing in them. However, by the time the Poughkeepsie Journal reprinted the poem as A Visit from St. Nicholas or Santa Claus, it was January 16, 1828. By that time, Henry Livingston was in what turned out to be his last illness, and he died on February 29th. So, even if his household still took the daily papers at that point, he might not have noticed, or might have noticed but had more pressing matters on his mind, such as his own imminent death. So that's not affecting my consideration of Livingston's authorship claim. Foster gets intense about analyzing the word use of Moore and Livingston. I'm just going to cover a couple of those points. The original publication of the poem has the last line, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Later publishers of the poem changed that to Merry Christmas, which was comparatively more common. Foster points out that we don't have any examples of Moore using the phrase Happy Christmas in his known writings, whereas Livingston used it a lot. Livingston was also fond of breaking up his lines with exclamation points, using the phrase to the sky or skies, and using phrases with all, like for example, all snug. And these are all qualities of the poem, of course. Then, there's the names of the reindeer. Here we go from saying Livingston used these words real often to saying Livingston was uniquely placed to use these names. Here's how the reindeer names go in the earliest source. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Dunder and Blixen. Those last 2 names are a cuss word in Dutch, just meaning thunder and lightning. They've been ironed out in later publications into Donner or Donder and Blitzen. Henry Livingston was 3/4 Dutch and lived in an area of New York where most people had Dutch heritage, making him extremely likely to use Dutch swears as part of a list of comedy animal names. Fair enough. However, Foster makes it sound like Moore couldn't have known those words. Moore wasn't Dutch in descent as far as I know, but he was born in 1779 and grew up in Manhattan. And after all, even old New York was once New Amsterdam. There were lots of Dutch people around Clement Clarke Moore, is my point. He absolutely could have heard that phrase. I'm gonna break my promise from earlier and talk about what might have happened. Because if we're going to seriously consider Livingston as the author, it's worth checking the likelihood of different ways the poem could have gone where it did. One of the nice things about the Livingston claim is that the chain of events that would have to happen for the poem to be misattributed are only about as far-fetched as the mainstream story. For the poem to hit print anonymously, the exact thing that happens in the Moore story could have happened to Livingston. Someone visiting him liked it so much that they left his house with a copy and either sold it or copied it out for someone else who sold it to the paper in Troy. We know that exact type of thing happens because, whoever wrote it, this is evidently how it got to be published. And of course, we also know Livingston published some of his work anonymously. So, what about a simpler chain of events, where Livingston himself sells a poem to the Troy Sentinel without attaching his name? For me, the only argument against that is distance. Livingston was selling poems to papers in Poughkeepsie, where he lived, and New York City, about 85 miles south. Troy is about 85 miles north as the crow flies. They're all on the Hudson River, but they're a ways apart. And there's no obvious reason Livingston would send his work to Troy if he could publish it in his hometown or in New York. But here's another hypothetical. What if Livingston published the poem earlier than 1823, in some other paper we haven't identified? Or as a newspaper carrier's New Year's address even, and then didn't really give it much more thought because he didn't expect it to blow up the way it did. And what if, in this form, Moore read it once somewhere and memorized it, then recited it for his kids later on? What if? Indeed, what if? One of the Moore defenders' arguments is that Moore was an honest and moral man who couldn't have been lying about writing the poem because he would have had to lie steadily for decades about being the author while living with the guilt that would bring. That doesn't hold water to me. He could have started out just reading or reciting the poem for his kids, then realized they thought he'd written it and been too embarrassed to correct them, and then the poem blew up and he really couldn't walk the story back. He could have convinced himself it didn't matter. We know for sure that he considered it to be fluff in comparison to the rest of his work. Or he could have remembered it after reading it once somewhere and then genuinely thought he'd made it up himself rather than just recalling it. People do that sometimes. There are legal cases about it. Helen Keller, of all people, when she was a child, this happened to her. She wrote a short story that she was convinced that she had made up, but it was close to an existing story a teacher had read to her. And all of a sudden, there were adults going, "This child has committed plagiarism!" If it could happen to her, it could happen to Moore. I don't think there's a clear case for Livingston. I was hoping to use the phrase, "here's the clincher," at this point, and it's too bad I won't get to do that. But part of the fun of making these videos is to get myself to learn about a topic. It makes me be thorough with my background reading when I know I'm going to have to sound like I know what I'm talking about on here. And, ideally, I should be able to change my mind if the info available contradicts what I thought I was going to say. I went into this thinking it was an extremely convincing claim, though I would present it humorously. And I'm coming out of the background reading thinking the claim is still convincing enough to make me seriously consider it, but also, Foster doesn't have as strong a case as I thought he did. He distorts the facts, He relies on emotional appeals in order to make his case. I still think the Livingston claim has some substance to it. But I can uncomfortably see that I wouldn't be thinking that at all if Foster hadn't made an overwhelming case for it in the first place. Maybe the lesson for me is also don't believe everything you read. The nice thing there is that either the Moore acceptors or the Livingston believers could point to that and say, how true. So I've got something to offer to everyone. And to all, a good night. Up on the housetop, reindeer paws, out jumps good old Santa Claus, down through the chimney with lots of toys, all for the little ones' Christmas joys. Ho, 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 who wouldn't go? Ho, 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 who wouldn't go? Up on the housetop, click, 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 down through the chimney with old Saint Nick. Also, I really like how you're touching your nose as a way of getting my attention.